Welcome to episode 2 of Socialites podcast with me, Gustav Hultgren, as your host. In this series of programs, we will interview people of interest with connection to Ukraine in order to inspire and inform our listeners about the businesses that our members are active in. We are always looking for interesting people to interview in this series, so if you do have someone that you want to recommend, please make sure that you contact us. You can find our details on our webpage, socialite.nu. In today's episode, we sit down and talk with Scott Brown, who is managing partner at the renowned law firm Frishberg Partners here in Kiev. We go through some recent developments with regards to residence permits for us foreigners that live in town. We also have a discussion about the general development and prospects of the legal industry in the country, as well as Scott offering us some useful advice for people that consider investing in the country. Let's just roll the tape. We hope you like it. So I'm sitting here together with Scott Brown. Thank you very much for taking the time to see us today. We wanted to talk a little bit about some article that you wrote with regards to immigration law. But first, maybe it would be interesting for us to hear a little bit about yourself and your background and what brought you to Ukraine.
My family does have some Ukrainian background. My grandfather was born here. He left Ukraine when he was an infant. He was born in Western Ukraine. From my father's side of the family, there's no Ukrainian. When I was studying undergrad in New York, I was kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And there were very few options. I knew basically that I was going to go for legal, for the legal field. I was going to go for law school. But at that time, I needed to really pick something to focus on in my undergraduate studies. So there was this opportunity with the Shevchenko University here in Kiev to do the first foreign exchange of students. And that was way back in 1990. So they sent the first set of students for about 6 months. And then they pulled them back. So they tried for the a second attempt at doing it. There was a whole bunch of problems in terms of housing and administration, giving them the proper, legal curriculum, or actually educational curriculum. So I decided to be the guinea pig and go the second time. And this was in 1990 to 91. And I actually stayed for 1 year. The reason that I chose to come to Kiev was because of my because of my Ukrainian background, and also because I really didn't know what I wanted to do, prior to law school. Was it focus on political science, focus on learning a language? In the end, I wound up focusing on Russian area studies. At the time, they didn't teach Ukrainian to foreign students, and I didn't know Ukrainian or Russian, even though I do have Ukrainian background. So I learned Russian at the university, and I took a lot of different courses in Russian language, most of which I didn't understand, but I was in attendance and I was able to pass the courses in the end. That's basically the story of how I first came here. During that time, during my studies, I also had the opportunity to take a 6-month study period at the Institute of Foreign Relations, and during that time I met Alex Frishberg. So I became friends with him. I went back and finished my undergraduate studies, and he offered me an opportunity to come and do an internship before I went to law school. So I spent about from 93 to 94 in doing an internship, basically doing everything in the office, from translating to secretarial work to doing paralegal work, etc. And then when I finished that, Alex said, you have to go to law school because there's no other choice. I said, Alex, actually, I was planning on going to law school anyway. So I left, finished my legal studies. Each summer I came back and worked with Alex under an internship. And at the end of my legal studies, which I did in Columbus, Ohio at Capital University, I came back after I got my diploma and started working right away. And I have no experience in U.S. law whatsoever. It all is Ukrainian law.
Fantastic. This is really, I guess you're one of a kind.
I would like to think so.
So, Scott, we were talking a little bit about your background. It's truly fascinating story how you ended up where you are today. But I know that you also wrote very recently an article about the updated immigration legal framework here in the country. Can you tell us a little bit about this? I know that it's always a recurring burning theme for all of us expats here in the country.
Yes. Over the last 2 years, the immigration rules have been changing and fluctuating, basically developing into some kind of cohesive system that maybe lawyers, maybe not the usual layperson, but maybe lawyers that can understand exactly how and what you need to do to have someone properly registered here and to bring them through the immigration procedures that are in place. Again, like I said, this area has been developing over the last 2-3 years. In the past, there were really no immigration rules. They were written in law, but they were never implemented in practice. So there were really no consequences in breaking the immigration rules, meaning you could stay more than 90 days here. It was never a problem. You could leave one day, come back. There was never this 90-day out of 180-day rule. So about 2 years ago, we started really monitoring the immigration rules because they started to follow the European immigration rules. Not quite as strict as the immigration rules in the States, even though there is a visa-free regime for EU and US citizens, Switzerland, Japan. They decided that those that were going to stay over 90 days, basically the Ukrainian government decided that those who were staying over 90 days should not be deemed as tourists. They basically should have some immigration procedures and they should be registered somewhere. As it's done in every other country. So they really started to enforce the immigration rules. And in enforcing the immigration rules, they started to rewrite everything because they saw that the original laws, the original rules, were in no way practicable for anybody. I mean, for lawyers and for the immigration authorities, for the border patrol, etc. Reason why we did this last update was because there were some simplifications made to the immigration rules. They removed some of the document requirements, made it a little bit more simple. Prior to these new amendments, there really was a lot of bureaucracy and paperwork involved in getting the immigration in guiding someone through the immigration procedures. Unfortunately for companies and for individuals, when you're a businessman, you don't really have time to deal with these types of issues. When the system is as complicated as it is, even though they've simplified it, it still is complicated. You really look for outside help. And I think that, I hope that the updates that we do on the immigration rules, this was not the first article that I've done on immigration rules in Ukraine. I think that it can be very helpful for people to get a grasp of how the system works and what they need. I mean, in terms of documentation, it's still a bit difficult. I mean, not everybody can find their diploma from, 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago, dig it out, have it certified by a apostille and sent over here. So there are still some complications there, but in any case, it's becoming more and more simple each day. And I think it will be even more simplified as the local authorities themselves become more accustomed to accepting foreigners as temporary residents in Ukraine.
So what would your advice be for someone who spends quite a lot of time here in the country?
Well, in that type of situation, if you want to stay in Ukraine for over 90 days, then you really have to get yourself registered and go through the proper immigration procedures. That means that you need to have legal grounds for doing that. Unfortunately, enjoying the climate in the city itself is not a legal ground for staying here over 90 days and for receiving temporary residency here. There a few options to go through. For those that have Ukrainian background, they can apply for permanent residency. It requires a lot of background documentation about the person's heritage. But it may be worthwhile if you're going to stay here on a long-term basis and not leave 90 days and stay out of the country 90 days and then come back for 90 days and then stay out of the country for 90 days. That can be quite tiring and expensive for, someone that's wants to really dig in their heels and stay in Ukraine. Another option is to find a job in Ukraine, become employed by a Ukrainian company. This way, you can get your immigration visa, your visa D, and you can then apply for temporary residency and have a temporary residency permit. With a temporary residency permit, you're allowed to stay in Ukraine as long as you want and come and go as much as necessary or as you please. This gives you basically a passport for a year. Unfortunately, the temporary residency permits are in practice only issued for 1 year and you have to renew them each year. But it's not a difficult process if you're really going to be staying here for longer periods than 90 days out of each 180-day period.
So how are these rules being enforced at the moment? I hear a little bit about people getting stopped in the passport control. They have too many days, but is it really, what is the downside?
A strict reading of the law, you will see that there's an incredible downside. I mean, there's a possibility that if you have, grossly violated the immigration rules by staying over 90 days. I mean, we've had situations where people have come to us and they ask us, well, I need to leave. And I've stayed in the country for over 90 days. Well, actually, I've stayed in the country for 3 years and I haven't left. And now I need to leave for personal or, for family reasons. What should I do? Obviously, 3 years could be considered a gross violation, and they run the risk of being deported or being banned from coming back in the country. At the same time, in practice, this isn't being done. I don't know of any cases where someone has been deported or where someone has been banned from coming back in the country. I think it's still being pretty weakly enforced. I think that the Ukrainian government realizes that it needs to have foreign investment, it needs to have foreign visitors, it needs the tourism business. So I don't think it's acting as strictly as it is written in the rules. The cases that we've seen where people have tried to leave and they've stayed over 90 days, they're faced with a fine and they can come right back in.
And for people that are living here together with their families, spouses, children, how is the rule work set for those guys?
Well, it's quite simple. First, the principal is the person that does the main work, the employee, whether it's the husband or the wife that has, whether it's the husband or wife that is working here and has an employment contract and a work permit and a temporary residency permit. What basically happens is once they go through their immigration procedures, then they can invite their spouse and their dependents, their children, to come in on the basis of their immigration documents, and the spouse and the children then will receive also temporary residency.
And they go through basically the same process then?
Yes, same process.
But the legal grounds is the work permit of the person who's employed here.
Right. Either you're employed by a legal entity, or you're employed by a representative office, or a branch of a foreign bank, or there are several other ways that you can gain temporary residency as a principal, as the main person in the family, as the breadwinner, as it's put in Ukrainian legislation. Whether you're working with an NGO or you're working with a religious organization, once you get your basic immigration procedure completed and you have your temporary residency, then you have the basis to then invite your spouse and your children to come into the country and also apply for temporary residency on the basis of your documents. So that means they receive the same amount of time for temporary residency as head of the household.
So clearly there has been some changes in the legislative framework for residency permits. As with everything, I mean, my advice would probably be to try to deal with it before it becomes an issue. If you don't have a work permit, you should try to get one. And by all means, of course, Scott, we can surely pass people on to you if they need some help and advice with this, I think.
Well, thank you. I would like to point out one thing. It's not just the immigration, but it's Ukrainian legislation itself. My advice to foreign investors here, in addition to going through the proper immigration procedures, when you're doing business here, my advice is don't wait for a problem to happen. When you come into this country, it's a country in fluctuation. It's changing. It's an emerging market. The rules are changing every day. It means that when you're doing any kind of business transaction, you should get the proper legal assistance up front. Because if you don't, and you wait and a problem comes, you're going to spend more money getting yourself out of the problems than you would if you're paying good money for a good, solid, legal foundation of your business here. And it's for any transaction and in any sphere of business here. Really, do your homework first. Get your legal assistance. Make sure all the documents are properly drafted and everything is in place before you sign on the dotted line.
I can only agree. I put myself in that situation, unfortunately, a couple of times, and I've deeply regretted it and tore my hair out over this type of issues.
Definitely. You spend more money on the lawyers like it. You spend more money on them digging you out of your problem than if you had just done everything in the beginning. But it's common. It's quite common. Nobody wants to even think that when you're going into a business that something wrong is going to happen. You go in with a positive attitude that everything is going to be worked out. And if some problems come along the way, we'll work them out. But sometimes the problems just keep piling up, and you don't realize that they're problems until one day the rug is just swept out right from under you, and someone says, well, we have this problem, but it stems from all of these other problems that we had. And then you look and you say, oh, that's a huge hill to climb. It's the truth. I mean, it happens to a lot of, businessmen here, a lot of businesses.
What do you think about the legal developments, generally speaking, in the country?
Well, generally speaking, I think the legislation is developing in the proper direction. It's basically mirroring the EU and some of the US legislation. The problem with it is it's very nice on paper and it looks very detailed and intricate, but in practice, it's sometimes very difficult to implement what the lawmakers, the legislators, what they have written down. And the problem with that is sometimes they borrow laws from other countries, especially from Russia. I've seen that. The situation is absolutely different in Ukraine. And so the laws need to be basically tailored to what Ukraine needs, not just copying laws from other countries that have good experiences. Because each country is unique and each country has its own, social problems. But what the legislators really need to do is not only just take and translate a law that's working in another country, but also to adapt it and tweak it so that it works under the Ukrainian system. And I think that that's the biggest challenge of moving ahead with the legislative system, is to keep adapting it, to keep bending it and making it flexible so that it works in Ukraine, make it specific to Ukraine.
So it's almost then a case of that legislation is moving ahead faster than the needed institution building that should come in parallel.
Well, I mean, the legislation moves very fast. I have to agree with you. It's the implementation. It's the environment that it was built for, is for an advanced environment. Whereas it looks very good, again, on paper, and it looks like it would work in a very, developed society. Whereas here there are a lot of things, in reality, the social infrastructure, the pension, taxes, that really need to be reformed on a day-to-day basis and not as a piece of legislation that's supposed to encompass everything. That's the problem what you get with the local authorities, because they all have their own interpretation of the legislation. So you'll go to one local authority and they'll have one opinion. You go to the next one, they'll have a different opinion. And you have no consensus, between the local authorities as to how to interpret the law. Because the law itself, maybe it might be a case that it's done on purpose, that they do make the law very vague and over-encompassing so that they can use it for other purposes, for interpreting it in their own way. And unfortunately, that type of situation breeds corruption, bribery, and confusion in the business community.
What is your take on the legal industry, generally speaking, in the country?
Generally speaking, I think that Ukraine has a unique legal industry. Whereas in many of the other emerging markets, you'll find a lot of foreign law firms are developing and growing at a very rapid rate, especially in Moscow, a place like Moscow. I mean, you see the foreign law firms almost on every street corner in Moscow, St. Petersburg as well. Here, it's a bit different. I think the local firms have taken advantage of the legal industry, and they're the firms that are growing more rapidly. A firm like ours, we stay small. We have a niche. We have our existing clients. We have a reputation. We have very good quality, service quality, but we're not as big as a name as you see some of the other the other foreign legal firms here. They are quite big, but their reputation is not as big as some of the bigger Ukrainian legal law firms. For instance, Osters or for Sayenko Kharenko. These firms have been growing rapidly, much more rapidly than the foreign law firms, which are now actually getting smaller. And of course, we don't fit into that because we're we're an independent small law firm that's kept our team for over 15 years, and we like to keep it that way. We don't see a need to expand greatly.
One thing I find a little bit confusing is always when I see Ukrainian lawyers working here in the country. So they would have a bar from the New York Bar Association, for example, or Washington or whatever it might be. Why is this? What is the significance of this? Isn't there a system here in the country that would provide a qualification?
I think the problem stems with the educational system here. What you're looking at is you're looking at a lot of lawyers coming out of the universities, much more than is necessary at this point in time in terms of the Ukrainian economy and the need to have lawyers as many as we do have in the West. In Ukraine, to be a lawyer, it is prestigious as it is in other countries. But I think that the means to getting your diploma are a little bit easier than it is in the West. I don't think there are the same challenges in the universities as there are in the West. So I think when you see these Ukrainian students leaving to get LLMs in other countries, especially in Europe or the United States, I think what they're showing to the law firms, the ones that are dealing a lot with foreign investment, that they've learned a Western way of thinking, of analyzing, of a Western quality of work product, what to expect from foreign clients, covering everything up front, trying to cover all the questions, not opening up questions. So there's a difference when, between the training that you receive in the West than there is that you receive in Ukrainian universities. And it's a little bit of a prestige to have an LLM and from a foreign university. But it also is great on your resume for getting some of the hard-earned vacancies that are in the law firms. I mean, they really look for that nowadays because you're going to be dealing with foreign clients, and the foreign clients are expecting foreign quality of service and foreign analysis and foreign way of thinking and proactiveness, which is something I don't think that they teach very well in the Ukrainian legal universities.
Is the legal education getting better in the country? I mean, you mentioned that you studied here yourself in the 90s. I guess it's been pretty dramatic change in those 20 years.
It's definitely been dramatic. Unfortunately, I think that the legal education, the educational system in general is not getting better. I think it's a case of it's easier to buy your way through university than it is to have to go through the rigorous studies that in the past you would have had to have gone through in order to get your diploma. And I think that's just a reality of life right now. Unfortunately, I see, it's my opinion, I see the educational system is deteriorating.
Is this something that you definitely are sure that will happen in the next 3 to 5 years?
I think that the New York Rangers will win the Stanley Cup within the next 3 to 5 years.
Is this something that you would recommend to our listeners?
I would recommend that if you are living in Kiev, besides doing all the partying and drinking that's abundant in this wonderful and green city, definitely go out and play sports, play something, do something healthy to get the alcohol out of your body, because it can be quite depressing come wintertime when you're still drinking and you have no physical activity to go along with it to balance out the alcoholism that's abundant in this country.
So who do you think that we should interview in the future?
I definitely think that you should interview my partner, Alex Frishberg. I think he has some of the most colorful, wonderful stories about the early days in Kiev. And he does have a book, which I'm sure he'll tell you about, but he has an enormous reserve of other stories that he would be gladly to tell you. And I think that the audience would just love to hear it. It may not just be a typical interview. You may have to sit for a couple of hours with him. But I think it would be extremely interesting for the audience.
I think Alex is probably quite keen on talking, so I guess he's within reach, so to say. Anyway, Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, and we look forward to hearing more from you, legal updates in the future maybe.
My pleasure. You will see more.
Thank you. So, dear listeners, that concludes the interview with Scott today. If you have questions regarding matters such as residency permit and work permits, please make sure that you get in contact with Scott and his team. The easiest thing is probably that you surf into the webpage at frishberg.com, where you can find all their contact details. We hope you enjoyed the show. Stay tuned to socialite.nu, where you can find the next updates and the next interviews. Thank you.